It's Outside the Book, coming to you from the Southern Kentucky Book Fest 2015. I'm your host, Barbara Deeb. And as we do every year, we go behind the scenes with the authors, beyond the written word. And we are very excited to have with us this day Diana Gabaldon, who is the headliner for this year's festival. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's lovely to be here.
You know, we do this show on an annual basis, and as I mentioned to you, we've had lines outside the building, but never lines like we've seen here today.
No?
You, of course, are the author of the very popular Outlander series of books. In addition, it's now been adapted into a television series.
That's right.
And you have a lot of fans out there.
Well, thank you very much. I'm extremely flattered that they'd, spend their Saturday with me, or rather, I should say, with us, because you have a lot of other excellent authors here today as well. So
you have such a fascinating background. We've got a little bit of time to talk about some of those things.
If you like.
Now, you come from the West, the Arizona area,
That's right.
born and raised, and your background relates nothing to what we find in your books. So share a
Oh,
little
no.
bit about that. Zoology, oceanography.
Well, the fact is that I knew from a very early age, from about 8, that I was meant to write novels. I knew that was my calling, so to speak. But I came from a very conservative family background. My father was fond of saying to me, "You're such a poor judge of character, you're bound to marry some bum," he said. So be sure you get a
Thanks,
good
Dad.
education so you can support your family. So with that going on at home, I thought perhaps I wouldn't announce that I wanted to write books. I understood, even at that tender age, that
Were
it was
you one
rather...
of those closeted writers, though, as you grew? I mean, were you
No,
constantly writing?
No, I never
No.
wrote anything until I started. Well, I shouldn't say anything. I wrote a ton of different things, but it was all nonfiction. But I still knew I was supposed to be a novelist, even though I went into science, and I liked science. I was good at it. I enjoyed teaching, but I knew I was still supposed to be a novelist. And when I turned 35, I said to myself, "Well, Mozart was dead at 36. Maybe you better get a move on here."
Get on it.
And so I said, "All right, I'm going to write a book." For practice. Not going to show it to anyone, not going to tell anyone what I'm doing. It's just for me to learn how to write a novel. Because to that point I had written all kinds of things, PhD dissertations and scholarly journal articles and popular science and textbooks and
But
Walt
wait,
Disney
I got to
comic
back
books.
up here.
Yeah.
Popular science and textbooks, she says, but also you wrote comic books
Comic books, yes.
for Disney?
Yes.
How did that play into the picture?
Well, it was sort of not quite an accident. My mother taught me to read when I was about 3, in part by reading me Walt Disney comic books. And I kept on reading them. When I was 28, I think, I was reading one and I said, "Well, this is pretty bad. I bet I could do better myself." So I found the name and address of the editor who handled that line, and I sent him this rather rude letter and said, "Dear sir, I've been reading your comic books for the last 25 years. They've been getting worse and worse." He said, "I don't know that I could do better myself, but I'd like to try." And luckily, I met Del Connell, a gentleman with a sense of humor. He wrote back and said, "Okay, try." And he sent me a format so I could see what a script looked like. I wrote him a story. He didn't buy it, but he did something much more valuable. He told me what was wrong with it. And he did buy my second story, and I continued to write for him for the next year and a half until the powers that be at Disney said, "We have 40 years worth of Carl Barks scripts in our files.
Oh.
Why are we buying new ones?" So,
There you go. Now let's back up. Okay, so mind you, with the popularity of this Outlander series of books and the adaptation to television, Diana tells us that she did this just to see if she could write a novel. Always knew she was going to be a novelist. So it took 18 months to write it, the
yes.
first book. 18 months for the publisher to say, "Okay, we're going to publish it."
Well, no, they actually bought it in 3 days, but it took
okay.
them another 18 months to decide what to call it because these books have no genre, or else they have all of them, and that's a problem from a marketing point of view.
Originally, it was to be called A Stitch in Time.
Well, I called it Cross Stitch was my
Okay.
working title, and it was published under that title in the UK. The U.S. people said, "Well, we love the book, but can't you think of something more exciting? This sounds like embroidery." And so I thought of Outlander, and they said, "Oh, great." We then sold it in the UK 6 months later, and they said, "Well, we love the book, but we can't call it Outlander because to us an Outlander is someone from South Africa. Can you think of something else?" And I said, "Well, my working title was Cross Stitch," and so that's what they called it.
I gotcha. Talk about the fact that when you started writing, the voice, and I've heard many writers talk about this, how sometimes the characters just really take over.
Yeah, they
And
do.
in this sense, it was a female voice that became dominant.
Well, I decided to write a novel and said, what's the easiest kind of book I could write? In a sense, making it hard is for practice. And I said, well, for me, maybe historical fiction. I was a research professor. I knew my way around a library. I said, okay, historical fiction seems easier to look things up than make them up. And if I turn out to have no imagination, I can steal things from the historical record, so, which works really well. And so I said, okay, fine, historical novel. Where shall I set this? Because I've got no background in history to speak of. So I was casting around looking for a useful time and place when I saw a really old Doctor Who rerun on public television. And I imagine your audience is familiar with Doctor Who. It was one of the really old Patrick Troughton episodes in which the Doctor had picked up a young Scotsman from 1745. And this young man appeared in his kilt. And I said, well, that's kind of fetching. I found myself still thinking about this the next day. I'm in church, and I said, well, you want to write a book. It doesn't matter where you set it. The important thing is pick a point, get started. Fine, Scotland, 18th century. So that's where I began, knowing nothing about Scotland or the 18th century, having no plot, no outline, and no characters. Nothing but the rather vague images conjured up by the notion of a man in a kilt, which is, of course, very powerful and compelling.
Very powerful. And then this female voice, because time travel plays a big role.
Yes, it's all her fault.
Blame it on her.
No, I began writing immediately, but I also began doing the research immediately and learned just a little bit about the Jacobite Rebellion, essentially Scots versus English. And about the third day of writing, I said, well, I must have a lot of Scotsmen, of course, because of the kilt factor. But I think it would be good if I had a female character, then we would have sexual tension. That's good. So if she's English, so we'll have lots of conflict. So on the third day, I introduced an English woman into the plot. Well, I didn't have a plot at that point, but I loosed her into a cottage full of Scotsmen to see what she'd do. Well, she walked in. They're all muttering to each other around the fire. They turned around and stared at her. I'm thinking, why? What's wrong? Why are they looking at her like that?
She wasn't wearing a kilt.
Well, she's a little odd looking. And one of them stood up and he said, my name's Dougal Mackenzie, and who might you be? And without my stopping to think, I just typed, my name's Claire Elizabeth Beecham, and who the hell are you? And I said, you don't sound at all like an 18th century person. So I fought with her for several pages, trying to beat her into shape and make her talk like a historical person. She wasn't having any of this. She just kept making smart-ass modern remarks. And she also took over and started telling the story herself. I said, all right, I'm not going to fight with you all the way through this book. I said, no one's ever going to see this. It doesn't matter what bizarre thing I do. Go ahead and be modern. I'll figure out how you got there later. So it's all her fault that there's time travel.
And what people don't realize is that you began writing the first in the series of Outlander books in the late 80s.
That's right. I began on March 6, 1988.
And so here we are today, extremely popular. You're in over 20 countries in
42.
over 20, in different languages, 38 now. Okay, I need to update my information.
Well, it's probably Wikipedia that's wrong. It 26 million copies in print is the third stat.
But we also now have a television series.
We do, luckily.
An
It's wonderful.
extremely popular television series.
I couldn't be more pleased.
Stars
They've done
Channel.
just a wonderful job with it.
Do you get to input on the TV series?
I do. I am officially a consultant on the show, and they send me outlines, they send me scripts, and best of all, I get to see all of the daily footage that they shoot. So I see every day, what they've been doing.
Which is not, doesn't always happen that way.
No,
Diana.
luckily for me.
How is it that you negotiated that, or?
No, when we signed the contract, my agent said, a consultant can mean anything or nothing, and it depends how well they like you or if they think you have anything to offer. As it is, though, I got along extremely well from the beginning with Ron Moore, the showrunner, and his production partner, Merrill Davis, and they were kind enough to come out to my house and spend 2 days with me talking about characters and backstory and plot lines and things like that. And we found that we were very much on the same wavelength. So, cautiously after they began production, they began showing me things, and I was extremely diplomatic in what I said about them.
And here we go.
And, little by little, they began to trust me, and I began, I had no choice but to trust them. And we get along very well.
So where are we at now? I mean, you've done what you set out to do at the age of 8. I'm going to be a novelist. Could you ever have imagined in your wildest dreams that you would be this successful, really?
I could have imagined it, but I didn't think so. My plan was, I was writing Outlander for practice. I thought, once I know what it takes to do a book, then I can, pick a genre that I like
Then I'll
mystery.
do my real
and,
book,
yeah,
right?
then I'll write a book that I mean to get published, and I probably will. I mean, I knew I was a reasonably good, competent writer, and I said, so then I'll probably spend like 12 years working my way up through the mid-list, and maybe become a bestseller around the age of 50 or so. At which point, maybe I can retire from science and do it full time. Anyway, it just kind of worked faster.
You can definitely retire, probably. So where do we go from here? What's next?
Well, let's see. The second half of season 1 has just begun for the show, and is doing extremely well, which does great things for your book sales. My editor called last week to say, well, Outlander is number 4, number 8, and number 10 on various permutations of the New York Times list this week. It has actually hit number 1 on a couple of them, on a couple of occasions.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. I
And
appreciate that.
continued success.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. We've been talking with author Diana Gabaldon. Outside the Book continues from the Southern Kentucky Book Fest at the Carol Nicely Center in Bowling Green. We had Diana Gabaldon join us earlier. Now we are joined by Chloe Neill, author who writes about Chicagoland vampires. Chloe.
Good morning.
But you're a transplanted Southerner who writes about the Midwest. Explain that.
I am. I'm not really sure how that came about. I grew up in Arkansas, eventually moved to Nebraska, where I've been for a while. I had visited Chicago in the early 90s and just kind of fell in love with it. And when I was thinking about where to place a supernatural series, Chicago has interesting history, interesting culture, people that some would argue are already kind of demons or supernatural creatures, so there was kind of a natural fit.
Now, vampires. Why write about vampires?
When I first started writing this book, which is around 2006, vampires hadn't kind of reached the crest, the post-Twilight crest that they had yet. So it was still kind of a new and intriguing idea. But for me, I write about supernatural creatures because I don't want to think about the workaday world worries, bills and going to a job. Writing about supernatural creatures lets you make up the rules on your own. And it puts this interesting new kind of drama that you have to face, where the stakes are very high, literally, since it's vampires.
No pun intended.
No pun very much intended.
Okay.
And they, the stakes are just different and they matter, and it's the kind of thing that gives me an escape as a writer, and hopefully to readers an escape as well.
And you run the gamut on your characters. They're all shapes and sizes. They come from all different parts of that world. So you had to do some research in that world, or?
I did. I've actually, so there are vampires, there are shapeshifters, there are nymphs that rule the flow of the Chicago River, for example. There's a siren that lives in Lake Michigan. So I did a lot of mythological research, looking into the myths of vampires and these other creatures across the world, and then kind of pulling from it what I thought would be an interesting and kind of a new twist on those creatures.
Don't you know that there is a siren in there, and then the nymphs do affect them in the
Of course
water?
they do. You've
Yes.
seen it green for
Yes.
for St.
St.
Patrick's
Patrick's
Day.
Day.
So obviously there is something going on there.
Now, shapeshifters, okay,
Yes.
gotta say, what a wonderful craft that would be to own,
Yeah,
right? How much
absolutely.
fun is that to write about?
It's a lot of fun. In my world, the shapeshifters operate in packs across the United States. Some are wolves, some are different creatures, but they have this kind of interesting earthiness and connection to the earth that's really interesting to write about. So I've made them lovers of kind of earthy, natural romance poetry because there's an affection for natural things that just seems to fit with them. So it's very different from these very kind of glamorous and chic vampires, and they bring a very different flavor to the series.
Do you believe that there are vampires in this world?
Metaphorically, absolutely. There certainly are people who I think take more energy from the world than they probably give back. But in terms of the paranormal, I'm not a big believer. There's a little part of me that would like to believe there's something different out there, but I'm too much of a scientist, I think, of mine to believe that that's really true.
Take us through your writing process, because I'm always intrigued. I
Sure.
really am by, just the very different ways in which authors, writers broach their subjects.
Sure. So I write 2 books a year pretty much, and each of these books is about 90,000 words. I will spend about 2.5 or 3 months writing, and then I'll work with my editor and spend about a month and a half, maybe 2 months more editing it. So what I will do typically is have a word count per day that I have to meet. First I'll do a synopsis for my editor, and then as I'm writing I'll have a word count per day that I'll have to meet. And it's kind of like running a marathon. You can't run it all at once. You've got to pace pace yourself. You've got to do a little bit every day. And hope at the end that you're going to end up with a book. I've written 15. I'm about to actually I started my 16th yesterday in my seat at the book fair. Thank you. So there's always that moment of panic about halfway through where I don't think I'm going to be able to finish it, even 15 books in. So I try to remind myself that I've done this before. I'll be able to finish it. It's just a matter of staying calm throughout the process and letting it happen a little bit at a time.
Pacing.
Exactly.
Is there some? You said you started writing it yesterday. Is there some inspiration? Does something hit you and you say, okay, this is going to be a big part of the book?
Absolutely. And I don't remember if I was on the plane yesterday or if I think I was on the drive from Nashville to Bowling Green, and I had an idea, and I actually had forgotten about it until I sat down I have a little mini laptop that I take when I travel, and had to make sure that I get it down or I will completely forget about it. So.
And we can look for number 16 when?
Number 16, well actually this will be number 12 in the Chicagoland Vampire series, which is what I'm writing right now. That will be out in March. And then I have also 3 young adult books in the Dark Elite series and a brand new series that starts in August called Devil's Isle, which takes place in New Orleans, an alternative New Orleans.
Ooh.
I'm very excited about it. I'm reading a really great book actually about voodoo culture right now. So the chance to research things like that is just fantastic.
Fantastic. Can you say overachiever or prolific?
I like to think of that. I hope Penguin is happy with what I've done so far, and that readers obviously are enjoying it.
Obviously are. Chloe Neill, thank you for sharing time with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
We've been talking with author Chloe Neill. Outside the Book from the Southern Kentucky Book Fest continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're very honored to have with us Dr. Mary Ellen Miller, who is going to share the story of her most recent publication, Every Leaf a Mirror. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about a Jim Wayne Miller reader. People are familiar with your late husband, Jim Wayne Miller, and you decided to collaborate and put together this book.
I worked with my co-editor, Morris Scruggs, who's here, minding my purse right now. But his role was a lot more important than that. I'm not sure I could have done the book without Morris. I did the poetry section and the introductions for it and an essay on it. He did, and I also did some of the fiction. He did the criticism and the fiction and criticism and essays and fiction.
And did you need the collaboration because of the intimacy and the close? It's almost like you need a point of detachment when you're dealing with something.
Absolutely. I had known Morris since he was a student here. Also knew that he had published 2 successful books with University Press of Kentucky, which is where we were going because we were invited to. I was invited to do this book, which I was enormously thrilled and excited about. That was the first. And so I got my co-editor and we went to work. And working with the work of your late husband is a different kind of experience.
Especially when he was so revered. I mean, he was and popular, and I mean, this is a difficult subject to deal with.
Yeah. He was revered and popular. And I tried to choose poems that I knew he was particularly happy with and that many people had asked about or asked to have copies of or something. Then I chose some that were not very well known, that had not even been published, as a matter of fact.
Oh.
And then I chose some that were my particular favorites. And a few of them were not his particular favorites, but I wanted to get my point of view in there somewhere, so I did that. And then the job of sorting them into categories, which I did, which he had never done. There wasn't any occasion to. So I poems about family, poems about home, the mountains, and so on, poems about other poets. So that was sort of heartbreaking, but it was a very, very wonderful experience at the same time.
Can we go so far as to say a labor of love?
Labor of love was exactly how I thought of it.
Jim Wayne Miller, for those of you that had the opportunity to know him and to love him, you more than anyone, he was so gracious. He came to my literary club once to do my program.
He was a big admirer of yours.
Well, thank you. But for those watching, what would you want them to know about your late husband?
I say in my introductory essay that he was kind of two-sided person. And he was, both in personality and in interest. He was very much at ease at the lectern, reading his poetry, giving commencement addresses, serving on academic panels. But he was happiest when he was wading around in the mud and trout fishing at his home in North Carolina, or going fishing here in Barren River Lake. That was his great passion outside of his work and his family.
And his family, of course.
Yeah.
And we're delighted to have you join us today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
Dr. Mary Ellen Miller, who has crafted a labor of love. It's called Every Leaf a Mirror, a Jim Wayne Miller reader. Outside the Book continues. From the 2015 Southern Kentucky Book Fest, I'm Barbara Deeb, where more than 150 authors have gathered, and the crowds are getting a little bit louder, so we're going to have to speak up a little bit, but we are honored to have with us Terry Brooks. Thank you for being here.
Oh, good morning, Barbara. Thank you for inviting me.
Your books are labeled in the genre epic fantasy.
So they are.
So they are. Is that what one sets out to do?
Well, I don't know about others. I set out to write an adventure story. I just didn't want to set it in the current world because I was afraid I would have to do research in order to get my facts right. So I set it in an imaginary world filled with imaginary creatures, feeling that if I was asked about my resources, I would say, yes, they're all up here.
You know, in this imaginary world, you are the creator.
I am.
You are.
I am the god of my own world.
You are.
Yes.
What's that like?
Well, I don't know. You know, there's a certain responsibility, obviously, because there's a requirement of consistency for epic fantasy in order to make it believable enough that readers will buy into it for the period of time that they're engaged in the book. And I think there's a demand that it not be dumbed down either. You want it to be concerned with issues in our own world, for example. You don't want it to be one-dimensional. So there's a surface story that deals with usually a quest of some sort, but there are deeper issues that are being addressed. Things like destruction of the environment, things like moral responsibility, things like making hard choices when there are no good choices to be made.
So is that important to you that your books carry those messages?
It is important to me because I think all good literature has those elements present in one form or another. The books that I really loved, I was an English major, I've read all my life. The books that I really love and the ones that impressed me when I was growing up and when I was in school and then afterwards were the ones that had something more to say than what was on the surface of the story, and had a deeper meaning for those people who wished to take a look at something beyond just the surface story.
What makes a good character? You mentioned being the god of your own universe, and you can create these characters so you can give them this moral fiber.
But they have to be compelling, obviously. I think you do that by understanding that you have to emulate the way people are in real life. So characters can have strong qualities, but they also have flaws. People are flawed. It's the nature of who we are. And overcoming those flaws or coming to terms with them, I think, to a great extent, are what make them interesting enough to us to want to know them better and to stay with them for the duration of a story.
So an English major, obviously you like writing. When you look at where you are now with this amazing amount of work that you've put forth, are you where you wanted to be?
I don't think I ever knew where I wanted to be when I started out. I think young writers start out just wanting to have somebody look at their work. Just give me a shot, you know, and then please let me publish one book. And then, oh, maybe I can do one more. Please give me a chance at that. But looking ahead, I've been writing stories now for 50 years. I've been published for almost 40. And at no point did I have a timetable. I just wanted to keep the quality of the work even, at least, if not better, from one book to the next. I hate it when I'm disappointed by an author's work. I didn't want anybody to feel that about my own work, so I worked very hard at trying to keep the quality level even, at least. You know, I think looking back at it now, I can say this is about as good as I could have expected it to be. I don't have any particular regrets. I think I've had more than my fair share of good luck.
And what's next? What's ahead?
Oh, I don't know, another book.
You think?
Hopefully another 20 years of writing. That would be good. I have other stories to tell. I'm always working on something new. I'm lucky enough now that I have a TV show coming out based on Elfstones of Shannara that will air either late this year or early next year, I think.
And it'll be called?
It's called Chronicles of Shannara.
Okay, so they kept the name.
They kept, well, yeah, you bet. They kept the name. I'm very excited about it. I've looked at it, some of the rushes, some of the trailers. Nothing's public yet. They're still filming it off in New Zealand, but it's getting closer, so I'm very excited about that. I think it's going to be a very successful experience.
Continued success.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've been talking with author Terry Brooks.